Today, we are taking a deep dive into cases with twists so unexpected, so incredibly jarring, that they feel like they were ripped straight out of a Hollywood psychological thriller. When we consume true crime, we often think we know the formula. We think we can predict the killer, understand the motive, and foresee the ending. But the three cases we are exploring today shatter those expectations completely. Some of these details are so bizarre, so convoluted, and so unbelievably dark, you might think they are the product of a screenwriter's dark imagination. But I assure you, every single detail you are about to hear, no matter how impossible it seems, is 100% true. If you think you know where these stories are going, or if you think you have the mystery solved, think again. Our first case is shocking, deeply complicated, and layered with more horrifying twists than you will ever see coming. This is not your typical story of a single murder. It is a labyrinth of tragedies, wrapped up together in an almost unbelievable, multi-generational nightmare. Let's turn the clock back to the mid-1980s. To the outside world, Sharon Marshall was the quintessential American success story waiting to happen. She was a teenager who seemingly had the entire world laid out at her feet, a bright and shining star in Forest Park, Georgia. Sharon wasn't just smart, she was exceptionally gifted. As a lieutenant colonel in the high school ROTC program, she commanded respect, showcasing a natural leadership that drew people to her. She was undeniably intelligent, consistently ranking as one of the best and brightest in her class, with a kind, generous heart to match her towering intellect. Upon graduating from high school in 1986, Sharon had achieved what most students only dream of. She earned a full-ride academic scholarship to the prestigious Georgia Institute of Technology. Her lifelong plan was to study aerospace engineering. She wanted to look to the stars and fulfill her ultimate dream of working at NASA. Despite this incredible, life-altering opportunity, Sharon never set foot on a college campus. Because beneath the veneer of the perfect student, Sharon was harboring a massive, life-altering secret. During the final, stressful months of her high school senior year, Sharon became pregnant by her high school boyfriend. Fearful of the consequences, she never told him about the baby. She hid her secret remarkably well from her peers, eventually giving birth in secret and making the agonizing decision to allow a wealthy couple from Texas to adopt the baby boy. However, the trauma and stress of the pregnancy had completely derailed her meticulously crafted life plans. The scholarship was gone. The NASA dream was fading. At one point, she desperately, but unsuccessfully, tried to run away with her boyfriend to escape her reality. After losing her chance to attend college, Sharon's life took a drastic detour. She ended up moving to Tampa, Florida, desperately looking for a fresh start. But she didn't go alone. She moved with an older man named Franklin Delano Floyd. Despite having moved across state lines with Frank, Sharon attempted to live a normal life and started to date another man. Soon, history repeated itself, and she found herself pregnant for a second time. Once again, she never told the baby's biological father about the pregnancy. This time, however, she couldn't bear to give the child away. She chose to keep the baby and raise him with Frank. In 1988, Sharon gave birth to a beautiful boy, Michael Gregory Marshall. Frank and Sharon had an incredibly strange, deeply complicated relationship. To outsiders, it was entirely unclear if their dynamic was romantic, familial, or something altogether more sinister. But the two lived together under one roof, and both took on the responsibility of providing for little Michael. Frank worked sporadically as a painter, but he constantly complained of a severe bad back, using it as an excuse to avoid holding down a steady job. Because Frank refused to work, the financial burden fell squarely onto young Sharon's shoulders. To keep a roof over their heads and food in Michael's mouth, the former aerospace engineering hopeful was forced to become an exotic dancer. They also began to heavily rely on government welfare checks just to survive the grueling weeks. At the club, Sharon was well liked. Her co-workers thought of her as a kind, gentle, and friendly soul who had just fallen on hard times. She became especially close to an 18-year-old fellow dancer named Cheryl Camesso. But where Sharon made friends, Frank made enemies. Despite the close friendship between the two women, Frank and Cheryl openly despised each other. They were known to have frequent, explosive disagreements, though dark rumors circulated that the two of them may have been involved in a brief, volatile romantic relationship behind Sharon's back. The tension finally boiled over on a fateful weekend in 1989. Frank, Sharon, and Cheryl decided to go on a boating trip together. While out on the water, a vicious screaming match broke out between Cheryl and Frank. The details of the argument remain murky, but the fallout was catastrophic. Following the boating trip, Cheryl, allegedly seeking revenge against Frank, made a devastating phone call. She reported Sharon to social services, informing the government that Sharon was misrepresenting her true income as an exotic dancer. Sharon had indeed been hiding portions of her cash tips so she could still qualify for the welfare checks they desperately needed. Because of Cheryl's call, Sharon was immediately stripped of her government aid. Frank was absolutely enraged. Consumed by fury over the lost money and Cheryl's betrayal, he drove to the club where Sharon and Cheryl worked. He cornered the 18-year-old girl just outside the business in the parking lot. Witnesses watched in horror as Frank violently punched Cheryl directly in the face during the altercation. Shortly after this violent confrontation, Cheryl packed her bags, telling her father she was leaving his house to stay with a friend for a while to let things cool down. But Cheryl never arrived. When she failed to call her father to tell him she was safe, he panicked and officially reported his 18-year-old daughter missing. Police soon discovered her abandoned Corvette parked at a local airport, gathering dust. A massive investigation ensued. Naturally, because of the very public, violent parking lot altercation, both Frank and Sharon were immediately named as persons of interest. But despite their suspicions, detectives could find absolutely no physical evidence tying them to Cheryl's sudden disappearance. Sensing the police closing in, Frank and Sharon hastily packed their belongings and fled the Florida area in the dead of night. This sudden flight only magnified police suspicion, especially when authorities realized the couple had begun using a rotating roster of fake names and aliases as they traveled across the country. In 1989, while on the run, Frank and Sharon officially got married. Frank loudly claimed to anyone who would listen that he only married her to give little Michael a proper family name to belong to. The newly minted family ended up settling down in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where Sharon, with no other options, once again resorted to working as an exotic dancer to pay the bills. Just like in Florida, Sharon easily made friends. People were drawn to her warmth. And just like in Florida, absolutely no one liked Frank. He was perpetually aggressive, controlling, and deeply unpleasant. History began to repeat itself when Frank got into yet another screaming match with one of Sharon's fellow dancers. When the woman bravely yelled that Sharon needed to pack her bags and leave him, Frank turned to her, his eyes cold, and responded, "If she ever left me, I'd kill her." Little did Frank know, Sharon was actively plotting her escape. She was quietly making plans to leave him for a kind man she had recently met at the club. Friends later alleged that Sharon would have left Frank years earlier, but she was utterly terrified of what the violent man might do to her, or worse, to her young son, Michael. But before Sharon could ever put her escape plan into motion, tragedy struck. Sharon was found unconscious on the side of a dark highway. Her body was battered, and to the responding officers, it appeared as though she had been the victim of a tragic hit-and-run accident. When questioned, Frank calmly claimed that he was fast asleep in his bed at the time of the accident. Sharon was rushed to the emergency room, clinging to life, but she never regained consciousness. Her loyal friends from the club constantly came to visit her in the intensive care unit. Many of them swore that she was actually showing signs of improvement, that her color was returning. But suddenly, without any explanation, Frank barred all of them from the hospital room. He banned anyone from seeing her. 5 days after the incident, Sharon died from her severe injuries. But the whispers began almost immediately. Her friends were deeply suspicious of Frank's controlling behavior. The attending doctor was also highly suspicious. Upon examining Sharon's body, the doctor noted numerous old, fading bruises that indicated a history of severe physical abuse. Furthermore, the doctor officially classified her death as a homicide, stating on the record that the specific blunt force head injury that killed Sharon was not consistent with being struck by a vehicle. Though investigators could not definitively prove that Frank was the driver who ran her over, or that he had sneaked into her hospital room to finish the job, everyone who knew them came to the exact same chilling conclusion. This suspicion was only cemented when Sharon's co-workers at the strip club had to pool their own tips to pay for her headstone, because Frank flat out refused to contribute a single dime. Instead of mourning, Frank immediately contacted life insurance companies. He was eager to claim the $80,000 policy he had conveniently taken out on Sharon's life just a few months prior to her sudden, violent death. But Frank had made a critical error. He had spent years jumping between fake identities, and the social security numbers he provided to the insurance adjusters continually bounced back as fraudulent. Frustrated, and greedy for the payout, he finally provided his real, legal name, Frank Delano Floyd. It was in that exact moment that Frank's decades-long web of lies violently unraveled. When the insurance company ran the name Frank Delano Floyd, federal alarms began ringing across the country. It turned out Frank wasn't just an abusive husband, he was a hardened, wanted fugitive with a terrifying criminal history. Back in 1962, when Frank was just 19 years old, he was convicted of the horrifying abduction and assault of a 4-year-old girl. He was sentenced to serve 10 to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. However, Frank was manipulative. He managed to get transferred to a mental hospital, from which he brazenly escaped by stealing an employee's vehicle. In a display of sheer audacity, the very day after his escape, he walked into a bank and robbed it, which led to his swift recapture. In 1972, Frank was released on parole. But his freedom was short-lived. Almost immediately, he attempted to abduct another woman from a gas station and was thrown back in handcuffs. This time, however, he managed to pay his bail, skipped his court date, and vanished into the wind. A federal warrant was issued for his arrest, but by using a constantly shifting array of fake names, he evaded capture for decades. That is, until greed pushed him to give his real name for Sharon's insurance payout. Realizing his mistake, Frank attempted to flee once more, but the FBI was already closing the net. He was soon captured in Georgia and thrown back into a federal prison to finish his original, decades-old sentence. For the grieving friends of Sharon, they felt that Frank's arrest was a small sliver of justice for her deeply suspicious, untimely death. But what about little Michael? During the chaos before he went on the run, Frank had dumped Michael into the social services system. The young boy was placed into foster care, where he finally found a loving, stable family. However, the foster parents were deeply disturbed by the little boy's behavior. Michael appeared to be entirely nonverbal. He didn't speak a single word, relying only on desperate screams and guttural moans to communicate his needs, hinting at years of severe neglect and trauma. From behind bars, Frank fiercely insisted he was Michael's biological father, demanding visitation rights. The traumatized child was frequently dragged into the prison visitation room. But when Michael exhibited sheer terror at the sight of Frank, authorities finally ordered a paternity DNA test. Frank fought the test tooth and nail, and for good reason. The results were shocking. Frank Floyd was not Michael's biological father. The prison visits were immediately and permanently revoked. But if you think this story ends with Frank rotting in a cell, you are gravely mistaken. The true horror was just beginning. In September of 1994, after serving just 4 years, Frank was paroled. The moment he tasted freedom, his obsession returned. He immediately began stalking Michael and his new foster parents in Oklahoma. Knowing the state would never grant a violent felon custody of a child that wasn't biologically his, Frank devised a terrifying plan. On the morning of September 12, 1994, Frank casually walked into Michael's elementary school. He marched into the office and demanded to see the principal, James Davis. When Davis refused to hand over the child, Frank pulled out a loaded handgun, shoved it into the principal's ribs, and threatened his life. Under the threat of death, the principal was forced to pull Michael from his classroom without alerting the teachers. Frank then forced Davis into his own truck at gunpoint, ordering him to drive deep into a wooded area miles away from the school. There, Frank tied the terrified principal to a tree, leaving him bound but unharmed, and sped off with young Michael. When the principal was finally discovered and the abduction was reported, a frantic, multi-state manhunt erupted. It took 2 agonizing months for the FBI to catch a break. Frank was finally cornered and arrested in Louisville, Kentucky. But there was no sign of little Michael. Despite relentless interrogations and massive search parties scouring the interstate, there was absolutely no trace of the boy. Frank sat in the interrogation room, stone-faced, refusing to yield an inch. When detectives begged him to reveal the boy's location, Frank leaned forward and coldly stated, "It's none of your business where he is. nor do I care how much any of you in Oklahoma miss him, or love him. As Frank stood trial for the federal kidnapping of Michael, the first of several massive twists was brought to light. In 1995, deep in Pinellas County, Florida, skeletal remains were discovered hidden beneath a thick bed of creeping vines. The medical examiner determined the victim had suffered a brutal beating before being executed with 2 gunshot wounds directly to the head. The bones lay unidentified for months. Later that same year, a mechanic in Kansas purchased a beat-up truck at an impound auction. While cleaning out the cab, he found a large, hidden manila envelope. Inside were 97 Polaroid photographs. The mechanic looked at the pictures and his blood ran cold. The photos depicted a young woman, bound, gagged, and severely beaten, her eyes wide with unimaginable terror. The truck, it turned out, had previously belonged to Frank Floyd. He had stolen it during his time on the run in 1994 before abandoning it. Detectives rushed the photos to Florida. A forensic anthropologist compared a distinct wound visible on the photographed woman's cheekbone to a fracture found on the recovered skull in the vines. It was a perfect match. The skeleton, and the woman in the terrifying photos, was finally identified as 18-year-old Cheryl Comesso, Sharon's old friend from the strip club. Frank was convicted for the kidnapping of Michael, who was still missing, and sentenced to 52 years. He was then dragged into a Florida courtroom for the brutal murder of Cheryl Comesso, found guilty, and formally sentenced to death. But the envelope hidden in that stolen truck held one more secret. A secret so dark, so completely mind-bending, that seasoned investigators literally could not believe it. Tucked behind the images of Cheryl were older, faded Polaroids. These pictures showed Frank assaulting a young, blonde girl. These images were much older than the ones of Cheryl. Detectives launched a nationwide search to identify this unknown child victim. It took nearly 2 decades. It wasn't until the year 2014 that the ultimate, horrifying truth was officially uncovered. To understand the absolute insanity of this twist, we have to go back to the 1970s. After Frank was paroled and while he was on the run for the gas station abduction, he met a woman named Sandy Chipman. Using the fake name Brandon Williams, he charmed her, and the two were hastily married at a truck stop. Sandy was a mother of 4, and she herself had a troubled past. When Sandy was caught passing bad checks, she was sentenced to 30 days in county jail. Having no one else, she left her 4 children in the care of her new husband, Frank. When Sandy was finally released 30 days later, she returned to her home to find it completely empty. Frank was gone. And all 4 of her children had vanished with him. It took Sandy years of desperate searching to track down her kids. She eventually found 2 of her daughters, Allison and Amy, dumped into different foster care homes. Years later, her son Philip, as a grown man, took a DNA test and was reunited with his mother. Frank had callously put them all up for adoption under fake names. But Sandy could never find her oldest daughter, a bright, beautiful young girl named Suzanne. The FBI analysts looking at the old Polaroids from the truck finally made the connection. Sharon Marshall, the brilliant high school student, the devoted mother, the victim of the hit and run. Her real name was Suzanne Marie Savarkis. She was Sandy Chipman's missing daughter. In a truly sickening twist of fate, Frank Floyd had kidnapped his own stepchildren. He threw the youngest 3 into the foster system, but he kept the oldest, Suzanne. He moved her across the country, changed her name to Sharon Marshall, and raised her as his own daughter. He forced her to call him Dad, while simultaneously subjecting her to years of horrific abuse. He stole her life, derailed her college dreams, forced her into exotic dancing, married her when she became an adult, and ultimately murdered her when she tried to escape his grip. And then, he kidnapped her child. It was a reality so twisted, the detectives wept when the pieces finally clicked together. Also revealed in 2014 was the final, tragic fate of little Michael. After 20 years of silence, Frank finally confessed from death row. He admitted that while on the run with a terrified boy in 1994, he pulled over on Interstate 35, shot Michael in the back of the head, and hid his small body in the brush. Despite massive excavation efforts, Michael's remains were never recovered, leading authorities to grimly conclude his body had been consumed by the area's population of wild hogs. To this day, Frank Floyd has never been officially convicted of Sharon's murder, though there isn't a single person involved in the case who doubts he was the one behind the wheel of that car. Frank still sits on death row, taking the full depths of his depravity to the grave. If you thought the twisted family dynamics of Frank Floyd were impossible to comprehend, our next case will leave you entirely speechless. The date is August 24, 1980. We are in the picturesque, winding valleys of L'Épingle-sur-Avallon in eastern France. Jean-Marie and Christine Villemin are a picture-perfect couple. Jean-Marie had just received a massive promotion, becoming a high-ranking foreman at the local factory, pulling the family into a comfortable, upper-middle-class lifestyle. They had just moved into a beautiful, newly built home, and they were celebrating the birth of their beautiful baby boy, Gregory. By all accounts, the Villemin family was thriving. They were the envy of their small, tight-knit rural village. But in small towns, envy can quickly curdle into deep, poisonous resentment. Shortly after their rise in status, the Villemin family's peace was shattered. They began receiving completely anonymous, deeply disturbing letters in the mail, alongside heavy-breathing phone calls in the dead of night. The anonymous stalker never asked for money. They never made demands. They only promised one thing: revenge. For 4 agonizing years, this psychological torture continued relentlessly. The stalker seemed to know their movements, their schedules, and their secrets. The threats even expanded to include Jean-Marie's aging parents. Then came the dark afternoon of October 16, 1984. 4-year-old Gregory was playing happily in a pile of sand in the front garden of their home. Christine was inside, doing chores, checking on him through the window. But when she looked out just a few moments later, the yard was empty. Gregory was gone. Panic immediately set in. Christine rushed out into the street, screaming her son's name. She jumped into her car and frantically drove around the small village, asking neighbors if they had seen their boy. But it was as if 4-year-old Gregory had vanished into thin air. As the local police began mobilizing a search, the phone rang at the home of Gregory's uncle. When he answered, a cold, distorted voice delivered a message that would haunt the country for decades.
I've kidnapped the boy. I've strangled him, and I've thrown him into the river alone. I have my revenge.
The very next morning, before the police could even begin dredging the water, Jean-Marie opened his mailbox to find a letter postmarked on the exact day his son was taken. It was written in block, sprawling letters. It read, "I hope you die of grief, boss. Your money won't bring back your son. Here is my revenge." Tragically, the anonymous caller had not been lying. Later that day, searchers found the lifeless body of little Gregory in the freezing waters of the Valone River, just 7 kilometers from his home. It was a horrific sight. The 4-year-old had been drowned. His hands and feet were tightly bound with cord, and his woolen winter hat had been pulled down firmly over his face. The Villemin family was completely and utterly destroyed. The murder of little Gregory horrified the entire French nation, sparking an absolute media frenzy that became known as l'affaire Gregory. The press quickly dubbed the anonymous, taunting killer Le Corbeau or the Crow, inspired by a famous French film featuring a town terrorized by a mysterious poison pen letter writer. With the entire country watching, the police were under immense pressure to find the Crow. The investigation quickly turned away from strangers and focused intensely on the sprawling, deeply resentful extended Villemin family. The police believed that the use of the word boss in the letters implied a bitter jealousy over Jean-Marie's financial success. In 1985, investigators brought in elite handwriting experts to analyze the cruel letters. Combined with a sudden, shocking witness statement from a 15-year-old girl, the police made an arrest. The suspect? Bernard Laroche, Jean-Marie's own cousin. The town was stunned. But Bernard fiercely denied being the Crow. And shortly after his arrest, the 15-year-old star witness dramatically recanted her testimony, claiming the police had ruthlessly pressured and coerced her into making the statement. Without her testimony, the judge was forced to release Bernard Laroche, clearing him of all charges. But Jean-Marie Villemin, fueled by unbearable grief and rage, refused to accept this. He stood on the courthouse steps in front of a sea of flashing cameras and made a terrifying, public vow. He declared that he knew in his heart his cousin was guilty, and he promised the world that he would kill him. But just weeks later, the case took a twist so jarring it sent shockwaves through the justice system. On March 25, 1985, a new team of forensic handwriting analysts reviewed the letters and came to a completely different, horrifying conclusion. They claimed the handwriting didn't belong to the cousin at all. They stated that the letters matched the handwriting of Gregory's own mother, Christine. The police theorized that Christine had murdered her own child and written the letters to deflect the blame. Jean-Marie absolutely refused to believe his wife was capable of such a monstrous act. Only 4 days after the experts pointed the finger at his wife, Jean-Marie made good on his public promise. He grabbed a hunting rifle, drove to Bernard Laroche's workplace, and waited in the shadows. As his cousin walked out of the building, Jean-Marie shot him dead at point-blank range. Jean-Marie was immediately arrested, convicted of murder, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. His vengeance had cost him everything. While her husband sat in a prison cell, Christine was officially charged with the premeditated murder of her own 4-year-old son. At the time of her arrest, she was heavily pregnant with twins. Placed behind bars, Christine was so desperate to prove her innocence that she launched a severe hunger strike. For 11 agonizing days, she refused all food and water, risking her own life and the lives of her unborn children. The sheer brutality of the situation forced the courts to intervene. An appellate judge reviewed the file and found that the handwriting analysis was entirely flimsy, entirely subjective, and that Christine had absolutely zero motive to kill the son she adored. She was finally freed. But the stress had taken a devastating toll. Upon her release, Christine collapsed and tragically miscarried one of the twins. She wouldn't be officially, legally cleared of all suspicion until 1993. Jean-Marie, given leniency due to his extreme psychological distress, was released from prison after serving just 2.5 years. The family was broken, battered, and bleeding, but they were still absolutely no closer to knowing who actually murdered Gregory. For decades, the ghost of little Gregory haunted the French justice system. The case was repeatedly reopened as technology advanced. Detectives tested the original rope used to bind him. They ran advanced DNA testing on his clothing. They swabbed the saliva from the back of the postage stamps on the crow's letters. But time and contamination had ruined the evidence. Every single test came back frustratingly inconclusive. In 2017, the country held its breath once more. The case was reopened, leading to 3 sudden arrests. Gregory's great-aunt, his great-uncle, and an aunt by marriage were hauled into interrogation rooms. But the family closed ranks. The great-aunt and uncle invoked their right to absolute silence, staring blankly at their walls. With no new physical evidence, they were released. The burden of this eternal mystery claimed one final, tragic victim. Shortly after the 2017 arrests failed, Jean-Michel Lambert, the original magistrate who handled the botched 1984 investigation, was found dead in his home. Unable to live with the immense public criticism and the guilt of never solving the murder, he took his own life, 33 years after Gregory was pulled from the river. Today, the investigation into the crow remains open. Detectives are now employing advanced AI stylometrics, mapping out the specific vocabulary, syntax, and punctuation used in the letters to pinpoint the killer's exact educational background and region. A new suspect is allegedly in their sights, but their name remains sealed. We can only hope that, after 40 years of pain, little Gregory finally gets the justice he deserves. Our final case is a missing persons investigation that features a twist so profoundly bizarre, it defies all logic and human psychology. Nicholas Barclay was born on New Year's Eve, 1980, the youngest of 3 siblings growing up in San Antonio, Texas. By all accounts, Nicholas had a normal childhood early on, but as he entered his preteen years, a dark, rebellious streak emerged. He began to develop a notorious reputation around his neighborhood as a deeply troubled kid. Nicholas was a fighter, constantly engaging in physical altercations at school and screaming matches with his mother at home. He skipped classes, openly threatened his teachers, stole shoes from local stores, and even broke into a convenience store in the middle of the night. By the time he was just 13 years old, Nicholas already had a thick juvenile criminal record, an official diagnosis of severe attention deficit disorder, and 3 crude tattoos his friends had given him with a dirty, unsterilized needle. His mother was at her wit's end. Exhausted and desperate, she begged her adult son, Jason, to move back into the house just to help control the wildly unruly teenager. The breaking point came on June 13, 1994. Nicholas had spent the afternoon playing basketball at a neighborhood park. As the sun began to set, he called home from a payphone, demanding someone come pick him up. His older brother Jason answered the phone. Jason looked at the clock, knowing their mother had worked a grueling late shift, and flatly refused to wake her up. He told Nicholas to stop being lazy and walk home. Nicholas hung up the phone. And he was never seen again. Tragically, because of Nicholas's extensive history of delinquency, absolutely no one believed he was in any real danger. The police, the neighbors, and even parts of his own family assumed the stubborn 13-year-old had simply run away in a fit of teenage rebellion. This theory was bolstered by the fact that Nicholas had a mandatory court hearing scheduled for the very next day, where a judge was threatening to send him to a strict juvenile rehabilitation center. But days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The only strange occurrence happened 3 months after he vanished. Jason frantically called 911, claiming he could hear his younger brother violently trying to break into their locked garage. Police rushed to the scene, weapons drawn, but found absolutely nothing. There were no footprints, no jimmy marks on the door, and no sign of Nicholas. Detectives couldn't fathom why Jason would invent such a story, but with no evidence, they left. Years passed. The dust settled over Nicholas's empty bedroom. The Barclay family slowly began to accept the agonizing reality that their son was likely dead in a ditch somewhere. But in 1997, exactly 3 years after he vanished into the Texas heat, the Barclay family received an impossible phone call. The authorities told them that Nicholas had been found. He was alive. The joy of the family was immeasurable, but the details of his recovery were staggeringly weird. Nicholas hadn't been found in Texas, or even in the United States. He was found huddled in a phone booth in the small, rainy town of Linares, Spain. According to the European authorities, Nicholas had been abducted off the street by an underground, international child trafficking ring. They claimed he had been smuggled across borders, flown to Europe, and held captive in horrific conditions for 3 years, before finally managing a daring escape. The police warned the family that Nicholas was severely traumatized. He had been repeatedly abused, and bizarrely, his captors had strictly forbidden him from speaking English, forcing him to learn and speak exclusively in French. Carrie, Nicholas's older sister, immediately booked a flight to Spain to bring her baby brother home. But the reunion at the Spanish police station was deeply unsettling. When Carrie walked into the room, the boy cowered in the corner, hiding his face under a pulled-down baseball cap and large sunglasses. He seemed terrified of her, claiming he was afraid she wouldn't recognize him and would leave him stranded in Europe. Carrie rushed forward, threw her arms around him, and tearfully declared that she would know her brother anywhere. But as they sat down to talk, the red flags began waving violently. The boy claimed that the intense trauma of his captivity had caused profound amnesia. He had completely blocked out almost every memory of his childhood in Texas. He didn't know his family's names, his old address, or his childhood friends. To prove his identity to the skeptical Spanish authorities and the American embassy, the boy had to pass a strict test. Detectives showed him a series of unmarked family photographs and demanded he identify the people in them. Miraculously, the boy pointed to the photos and accurately named the relatives. Satisfied, the embassy stamped his passport, and he was allowed to fly back to Texas with Carrie. But when the boy stepped off the plane in San Antonio, the rest of the Barclay family was confronted with an absolute impossibility. When 13-year-old Nicholas vanished, he was a fair-skinned boy with distinctly blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. The young man standing in their living room had jet black hair, dark brown eyes, and coarse, olive skin. Furthermore, his facial structure seemed much older, and he spoke with a remarkably thick, undeniable French accent. How did the family react to this stranger in their home? They accepted him. When questioned about his drastically altered appearance, the boy offered a terrifying, science fiction explanation. He claimed that to keep his identity hidden from Interpol, the child trafficking ring had subjected him to torturous chemical experiments. They had injected unknown serums into his eyes to permanently change their color from blue to brown, and used harsh chemical dyes to permanently alter the pigment of his hair and skin. To any rational outsider, the story was patently absurd. It was medically impossible. But the Barclay family was so blinded by grief, and so desperate to have their son back, that they actively ignored every single blaring siren of logic. They brought him into their home, enrolled him in the local high school, and demanded the police permanently close the missing persons case. The bizarre story of the kidnapped Texas boy who returned from Europe with a French accent quickly caught the attention of a documentary film crew. They asked to follow the family around to capture this miraculous reunion. The family eagerly agreed. But the film crew brought along a hardened local private investigator. And this PI wasn't buying a single word of the boy's story. The investigator began quietly trailing the boy, snapping high-resolution photographs of his face. He zeroed in on a physiological feature that cannot be altered by age, weight, or chemical dyes, the cartilage structure of the human ear. He compared the tight, distinct curves of the dark-haired boy's ears to the childhood photos of blonde-haired Nicholas. They weren't even close. They belonged to two entirely different human beings. The investigator took his findings straight to the FBI. In February of 1998, after the boy had been living in Nicholas's bedroom and attending high school for 5 full months, federal agents obtained a court order. They swarmed the house, demanding fingerprints and a DNA swab from the boy. The results came back in hours, and the truth shattered the illusion completely. The man sleeping in Nicholas's bed was not a 16-year-old American boy. He was a 23-year-old French citizen named Frédéric Pierre Bourdon. Bourdon was a notorious international con artist, wanted by Interpol. He was famous across Europe, operating under the moniker the Chameleon. He had spent his adult life stealing the identities of missing children and teenagers, living in over 15 countries under 500 different fake names to exploit the foster care system for free housing and attention. The jig was up. Bourdon was hauled into federal court, where he brazenly admitted to being an imposter, pleading guilty to passport fraud and perjury. He was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. But the case doesn't end there. The most disturbing question remained: how could a mother look into the dark brown eyes of a 23-year-old Frenchman and genuinely believe it was her blonde, blue-eyed teenage son? From behind bars, the Chameleon dropped a bombshell that flipped the entire investigation on its head. Bourdon claimed that his grand deception hadn't been a magic trick. He stated, under oath, that the Barclay family knew he wasn't Nicholas from the very first moment Carrie walked into that Spanish police station. He alleged that Carrie had deliberately smuggled him family photographs and whispered names and details into his ear, coaching him so he could pass the embassy's identification test. Bourdon told investigators that the family actively colluded with him, participating in the bizarre theater of his return. And he claimed he knew exactly why. Bourdon, echoing the exact suspicions of the private investigator, theorized that the family needed a living, breathing Nicholas to walk through their front door, to permanently close a very dark chapter of their lives. The private investigator firmly believed that Nicholas Barclay never ran away that night in 1994. He believed that Jason, the deeply troubled older brother struggling with a severe cocaine addiction, had lost his temper when Nicholas arrived home. The theory suggests Jason murdered his 13-year-old brother in a fit of rage, buried him in the Texas dirt, and staged the bizarre garage break-in phone call 3 months later as a sloppy cover-up to make police think Nicholas was still roaming the streets. If Nicholas came home alive, the murder investigation would vanish forever. Even if that Nicholas was a 23-year-old French conman. The FBI found this theory incredibly compelling. They prepared to haul Jason Barclay into an interrogation room to finally press him on the murder of his brother and his willing acceptance of an imposter. But before they could kick down his door, Jason was found dead. He had succumbed to a massive cocaine overdose, taking whatever secrets he held about the June night to the grave.
With Jason dead, the trail went ice cold. Frédéric Bourdon served his time, was deported back to Europe, and immediately resumed stealing the identities of missing children. As for the real Nicholas Barclay, he has never been found. His body remains undiscovered, and his tragic, mysterious fate remains one of the darkest unsolved mysteries in Texas history.